In 1942, at the height of the terror and tension brought by World War II, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned in concentration camps across the United States. In one of these camps, the prisoners were forced to work on the construction of a baseball field. Soon after, something unexpected happened. After some time, several prisoners were granted early release, but refused to leave. What could have happened? This is one of the most surreal stories that ever took place in a prisoner camp during World War II. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, life for Japanese American communities on the West Coast was, for all intents and purposes, simply another Sunday. Families attended church, children played in the streets, and farmers tended to the fields they had painstakingly cultivated for generations. It was a day of peace, utterly oblivious to the storm gathering over the Pacific horizon. Then the news crackled over the radio. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The shock was universal, a sudden cold dread that gripped the entire nation. But for Americans of Japanese descent, that shock was compounded by a terrifying premonition. They were Americans, yet they knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone that their faces would now be seen as the face of the enemy. Almost overnight, the atmosphere curdled. A wave of hysteria, fueled by decades of anti-Asian racism and wartime paranoia, crashed over the West Coast. Neighbors who had shared fences and pleasantries for years suddenly looked at families like the Tanakas with suspicion and fear. The line between Japanese, the enemy, and Japanese American, the citizen, was deliberately and completely erased in the public consciousness. Newspapers and politicians threw gasoline on the fire. Sensationalist headlines screamed of fifth columns and saboteurs hiding in plain sight. General John L. DeWitt, the head of the Western Defense Command, infamously declared, "A Jap's a Jap," arguing that there was no way to determine their loyalty. This racist rhetoric provided the justification for the unthinkable that was to come. In the dead of night, FBI agents began sweeping through communities, arresting leaders without any charges or evidence. Buddhist priests, Japanese language teachers, and respected businessmen were hauled away, their families left in a state of terror and confusion. These were not acts of national security, they were the opening moves of a racially motivated witch hunt, plain and simple. The betrayal was felt on the most personal level. Stores that once welcomed Japanese American customers now displayed hateful signs in their windows. Children were bullied at school, their former friends calling them traitors. It was a psychological onslaught designed to isolate and dehumanize an entire population, making them outcasts in the only country they had ever called home. Beneath the surface of patriotic fear lay a darker, more opportunistic motive: economic jealousy. Many Japanese American farmers had transformed marginal land into incredibly productive agricultural hubs. Their success was now used against them, with competitors and politicians eager to seize the valuable land and property that would soon be forcibly abandoned. It was greed, masquerading as patriotism. The narrative was set. The government, with the full-throated support of the media and a significant portion of the public, had successfully painted over 120,000 individuals, two-thirds of whom were American-born citizens, with a single, treacherous brush. They were no longer seen as individuals or fellow Americans, but as a monolithic internal threat that had to be neutralized. This carefully orchestrated campaign of fear and misinformation paved the way for one of the most shameful chapters in American history. It created an environment where the suspension of the Constitution wasn't just considered, but was seen by many as a necessary evil. The stage was set for a government to betray its own people on a scale never seen before. And before we continue with our story, please, if you appreciate deep dives into historical events that challenge our understanding of the past, consider subscribing to our channel. It's the best way to ensure you don't miss these forgotten stories. Also, hit that like button and let us know in the comments which city and country you're watching from. In the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was under immense pressure. The nation was reeling from the attack, demanding action and retribution. Powerful voices, from military leaders to West Coast politicians, were clamoring for the removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the coastal areas, citing military necessity as their justification, a claim that lacked any real evidence. On February 19, 1942, just over 2 months after Pearl Harbor, FDR yielded to this pressure. He picked up his pen and signed Executive Order 9066. The document itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic euphemism. It never once mentioned the words Japanese or Japanese American. It simply authorized the Secretary of War to prescribe certain areas as military zones. From these zones, the order stated, any or all persons may be excluded. This deceptively simple language gave the military unchecked power to remove American citizens from their homes based solely on their ancestry. There was no mention of trials, no requirement for evidence of wrongdoing, and no avenue for appeal. It was a blank check for mass incarceration. This single stroke of the pen effectively suspended the constitutional rights of an entire group of people. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable seizures and the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process were rendered meaningless. The very principles the nation claimed to be fighting for abroad were being systematically dismantled at home by its own leader. The cruelty of the order was in its cold, detached legality. It wasn't a passionate cry for revenge. It was a calculated bureaucratic order that sanctioned a profound injustice. It transformed neighbors into potential threats and turned the government into an instrument of racial oppression, all under the guise of national security. It was, quite literally, a betrayal signed into law. The War Relocation Authority, WRA, was quickly established to manage the logistics of this monumental human displacement. The government was now in the business of uprooting and imprisoning its own citizens. The speed and efficiency with which they moved was terrifying, a testament to the power of a bureaucracy mobilized against a defenseless minority. Posters began appearing on telephone poles and in storefronts up and down the West Coast. Headed "Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry," they gave families just days, sometimes only 48 hours, to dispose of their possessions, abandon their homes and businesses, and report to designated assembly centers. The nightmare had officially begun. Imagine the panic, the heartbreak. Families were forced to sell lifetimes of hard work for pennies on the dollar to predatory buyers who circled like vultures. They had to decide what few cherished belongings they could fit into a single suitcase. Pets had to be given away, farms left to rot, and dreams turned to dust in a matter of days. The order was a legal document, but its impact was deeply and devastatingly human. It was the sound of a business shuttering for the last time. It was the sight of a child's favorite toy left behind on a sidewalk. It was the feeling of a family turning the key in the lock of their home, knowing they would never return. With that signature, President Roosevelt set in motion a chain of events that would forever stain his legacy and the nation's honor. The pen, in this instance, was not just mightier than the sword. It was a far more cruel and indiscriminate weapon, wounding the very soul of American democracy in a way no foreign power ever could. The forced removal was a scene of quiet, heartbreaking dignity in the face of utter humiliation. Families gathered at designated points, churches, train stations, public halls, with numbered tags tied to their lapels, like parcels being shipped to an unknown destination. They carried what little they could, but their faces carried the immense weight of what they were leaving behind forever. They were first herded into temporary assembly centers, which were often hastily converted racetracks or fairgrounds. Families were assigned to live in horse stalls, still thick with the stench of manure. They slept on canvas cots crammed into these filthy, crowded spaces, separated from their neighbors by nothing more than a thin sheet, their privacy completely gone. This was a deliberate process of dehumanization. Stripped of their names and given family numbers, forced to live in squalor, the internees were being systematically broken down. It was a period of shocking transition, designed to make them more compliant for the next stage of their journey into the desolate heart of the country, far from the prying eyes of the public. After weeks or months in these wretched assembly centers, the final journey began. The internees were loaded onto old, dilapidated trains, often with the shades drawn and the windows sealed shut. They traveled for days, crossing mountains and deserts, with no idea where they were going. For the armed military police guarding them, it was a routine transfer. For the passengers, it was an exodus into nothingness. The destinations were some of the most barren and inhospitable locations in the United States. Places like Manzanar in the windswept California desert, Heart Mountain in the bitter cold of Wyoming, and Gila River in the scorching heat of the Arizona wasteland. These were lands nobody else wanted, deemed suitable only for imprisoning people nobody wanted to see. As they disembarked from the trains, they were met with a landscape that seemed alien and hostile. The swirling dust got into their eyes, their lungs, their food. The summer sun was a relentless hammer, and the winter winds cut straight through the thin walls of their new homes. It was a physical manifestation of their exile, a land devoid of comfort, devoid of hope. The sight of the camps themselves was a profound shock. They weren't towns, they were military-style installations. Rows upon rows of black tar paper-covered barracks stretched as far as the eye could see, all enclosed by the menacing geometry of barbed wire fences and guard towers. This was not a relocation, it was an imprisonment, plain and simple. The government called them relocation centers, a soothing bureaucratic term for what they truly were, concentration camps. While they were not the death camps of Nazi Germany, they were, by definition, places where a civilian population was concentrated and confined without trial, based solely on their race. The very existence of these camps was an affront to American ideals. This forced migration was a scar carved across the American landscape and across the lives of every single person who endured it. It was a journey away from everything they knew and loved, their homes, their communities, their freedom, and into a desolate void. They had been erased from the map of American life and exiled to a place called nowhere. The exodus was complete. More than 120,000 souls had been successfully uprooted and deposited behind barbed wire. Their journey had ended, but their long wait, a trial of endurance and spirit, was only just beginning. The question now was not just how they would survive, but how they would live in this new, bleak reality. The Gila River War Relocation Center in Arizona was, in a word, hellish. Spread across the desert lands of the Gila River Indian Reservation, it was a place of extremes. Summer temperatures routinely soared past 115 degrees Fahrenheit, while winter nights could bring a biting chill. And always there was the dust, a fine alkaline powder that a relentless wind drove into every crack and crevice. Life was lived in hastily constructed wooden barracks. An entire family was typically assigned to a single bare room, approximately 20 by 25 feet. The structures offered little protection from the elements. The walls had knotholes you could see through, and the flooring was simple plank wood with gaps. There was no running water, no kitchen, and certainly no privacy. Everything became communal and public, a stark contrast to the value Japanese culture placed on privacy and modesty. Toilets and showers were in separate communal latrine blocks, with no partitions or stalls. Eating meant long lines for unappetizing rationed food served in a noisy, crowded mess hall. Every aspect of life was regimented and stripped of personal dignity. The most soul-crushing aspect of camp life was the endless, mind-numbing boredom. Stripped of their professions, their ambitions, and their autonomy, the internees were left with nothing but time. The days bled into one another in a monotonous cycle of waiting in line for food, waiting for mail, waiting for news, waiting for a war to end that had made them prisoners in their own country. This enforced idleness was a form of psychological torture. Farmers who once worked their land from dawn till dusk now had nothing to till. Business owners who once managed thriving enterprises now had nothing to run. The loss of purpose was a cancer on the spirit, leading to widespread depression and a sense of profound hopelessness throughout the camp. The WRA tried to create a semblance of normalcy by offering jobs, but it was a poor substitute for a real life. Internees could work as cooks, doctors, or farmhands within the camp, but the pay was pitiful, a maximum of $19 a month. It was just enough to make them feel like cogs in the machine of their own imprisonment. Yet in the face of this systematic attempt to crush their spirit, the people of Gila River resisted in the most human way possible. They sought to create beauty and order in the midst of chaos and ugliness. They cultivated small gardens, coaxing life from the stubborn desert soil. They started schools for their children and published their own newspapers. They held religious services, both Buddhist and Christian, and organized cultural events to maintain their heritage. They were refusing to be defined by the barbed wire that surrounded them. These small acts of defiance were not about escape. They were about affirming their identity and their humanity in a place designed to take both away. But these efforts could only do so much to combat the gnawing emptiness. The young men, in particular, were restless, full of energy and ambition. They found themselves trapped in a state of suspended animation. They needed something more, a release, a passion, something that could make them feel alive and free even for just a few hours. Life behind the barbed wire was a daily struggle against despair. It was a test of endurance, a forced wait in a desolate purgatory. The people of Gila River were surviving, but they were desperate for something that could help them truly live again. That something, improbably, would turn out to be America's own national pastime. In the desolate landscape of Gila River, where hope was as scarce as water, something familiar and beloved began to take root: baseball. The game had long been incredibly popular within the Japanese-American community. For generations, it had been a bridge between their Japanese heritage and their American identity. Now, it would become something much more: a lifeline. At first, the games were simple, spontaneous affairs. Kids and young men would gather in the dusty fire breaks between the barracks, using makeshift equipment. A rolled-up sock might serve as a ball, a sturdy piece of scrap wood as a bat, and rocks or pieces of cardboard as bases. It was a way to kill the endless hours. These impromptu games were a welcome distraction from the grim reality of their situation. For a few precious moments, the players weren't prisoners with family numbers pinned to their chests. They were just kids playing a game. The crack of the bat, the cheer of the small crowd. These sounds briefly drowned out the hum of generators and the ever-present reality of the guard towers. The appeal of the game was universal. It offered a sense of order and rules in a world that had become chaotic and unjust. On the baseball diamond, there were clear boundaries, fair rules, and a definite objective. Your skill and teamwork mattered more than your ancestry. It was a small pocket of meritocracy in a world that had judged them solely on their race. As the weeks turned into months, the games became more organized. Men who had played on community teams, or even semi-professionally before the war, began to organize informal teams based on the blocks where they lived. These block teams fostered a sense of local pride and friendly rivalry, injecting a much-needed spark of life into the monotonous camp routine. Sears, Roebuck & Koza, through its catalog, became an unlikely supplier of hope. Families pooled their meager wages to order real baseballs, bats, and gloves. The arrival of a new piece of equipment was a major event, a tangible connection to the American life they had lost, and a symbol of their commitment to rebuilding a piece of it right there. The games provided a crucial emotional outlet. The physical exertion allowed the young men to burn off the frustration, anger, and anxiety that festered in the cramped barracks. It was a healthy way to channel their energies away from despair and into something productive, competitive, and most importantly, fun. It was therapy in the form of a ball game. For the rest of the camp, the games became a vital source of entertainment and community. On weekends, hundreds of people would gather to watch, cheering for their block's team. It was a chance to socialize, to gossip, to forget their troubles for an afternoon, and to feel a sense of belonging that the WRA could never manufacture. Baseball was more than just a pastime. It was an act of cultural and spiritual resistance. By embracing the quintessential American sport within the confines of an American concentration camp, the internees were making a powerful, unspoken statement. They were claiming their American identity, refusing to let the government's injustice define who they were. But for one man, these dusty, makeshift games were not enough. He saw the potential for something far grander. He didn't just want to play baseball to pass the time. He wanted to build a cathedral to the game in the middle of the desert, a symbol of resilience so powerful that it could transcend the barbed wire itself. That man was Kenichi Zenemura. He wasn't just a fan of the game. He was baseball royalty in the Japanese-American community. A skilled player and brilliant manager, he had organized professional leagues in California and even taken all-star teams to tour Japan. Playing against legends like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, baseball was his life's work. When Zenemura and his family were incarcerated at Gila River, the loss was immense. He had lost his home, his career, and his freedom. But watching the young men play in the dust, he saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. He envisioned something that seemed utterly insane to everyone else. A real grass-covered baseball field, right there in the heart of the desert. His idea was met with skepticism and ridicule. A grass field in the middle of the Arizona desert, with its scorching heat and rationed water. It was impossible. The camp administration certainly wasn't going to help. They saw baseball as a mere distraction, not a priority. But Zenemura's vision was born of a deeper understanding of the human spirit. He knew that this field would be more than just a place to play. It would be a project, a unifying purpose for a community that had lost its direction. It would be a symbol that they could build, create, and achieve something magnificent, even in the worst of circumstances. It was, in essence, a way to reclaim their own agency. Zenemura was a charismatic and relentlessly determined leader. He began to rally support, going from barrack to barrack, pitching his impossible dream. He spoke not just of baseball, but of dignity. He argued that they deserved more than a dusty firebreak. They deserved a proper ballpark, a field of dreams that they would build with their own hands. Slowly, people began to catch his infectious passion. The young men, desperate for a meaningful project, were the first to sign on. Then, older community leaders, seeing the potential for morale, lent their support. Zenemura's audacious dream started to look less like a fantasy and more like a plan, a blueprint for defiance. He wasn't just dreaming, he was a meticulous planner. He scouted the perfect location within the camp, a large, flat area that could accommodate a full-sized field. He drew up plans, not just for the diamond itself, but for dugouts, bleachers, and even a scoreboard. In his mind, this wasn't going to be some amateur setup. The challenge was immense. Building a baseball field is hard enough in a perfect environment. Doing it in a desert, inside a prison camp, with no proper tools, no budget, and no official support, was a monumental undertaking. It would require ingenuity, sacrifice, and an unwavering belief in the power of a shared goal. But Zenemura's dream represented a powerful psychological shift. Instead of passively waiting for their fate to be decided by others, the internees were choosing to actively shape their own environment. They were going to take a patch of barren, government-controlled desert and transform it into their own piece of paradise, one shovelful of dirt at a time. The decision was made. The community, under Zenemura's leadership, would build their field. It was an act of audacious hope, a declaration that even when stripped of everything, they still possessed the power to create. The construction of the Gila River ballpark was about to become one of the most remarkable stories of the entire internment experience. With the dream now a shared mission, the community mobilized. The construction of Zenimura Field, as it would come to be known, was a masterclass in resourcefulness and covert operations. The internees became experts at liberating materials needed for the project. Lumber for the bleachers and fence posts mysteriously vanished from camp construction sites. Tools were a constant problem. Shovels, rakes, and wheelbarrows were in short supply and strictly controlled by the WRA administration. So the internees improvised. They fashioned tools from scrap metal and wood. They worked in shifts, day and night, under the harsh desert sun, slowly but surely taming the unforgiving land with little more than their bare hands and sheer willpower. The first and most grueling task was leveling the field. The desert floor was uneven and littered with rocks and thorny mesquite bushes. Hundreds of volunteers, from teenagers to old men, formed work crews. They cleared the brush, hauled away rocks, and painstakingly graded the vast expanse of land using hand-pulled drags and water levels, ensuring a perfectly flat playing surface. Then came the most audacious part of Zenimura's plan: planting grass. Water was strictly rationed in the camp, and the desert soil was notoriously poor. Zenimura, ever the innovator, located the camp's laundry facility and figured out how to divert the wastewater, rich in soap and nutrients, through a complex series of hand-dug canals to irrigate the infield. They carefully planted seeds, tending to them with a devotion usually reserved for prize-winning crops. The first green shoots that poked through the dusty soil were a cause for camp-wide celebration. That fragile grass, struggling to survive in the harsh desert, became a powerful symbol of their own resilience. It was life and beauty where there was supposed to be none. As the field took shape, the project grew more ambitious. A towering backstop was constructed using salvaged telephone poles and chicken wire. Proper dugouts were excavated and roofed, providing shelter from the relentless sun. And most impressively, they built a grandstand, a multi-tiered seating structure that could hold thousands of spectators, all from borrowed lumber. The entire process was a testament to the community's collective spirit. Carpenters, engineers, and laborers all contributed their skills. People who weren't on the construction crews would bring water and food to the workers. The field became the focal point of camp life, a shared endeavor that broke down social barriers and forged an unbreakable bond of shared purpose. The WRA administrators, for the most part, turned a blind eye. They saw that the project was keeping the restless young men occupied and boosting morale across the camp. A busy internee was a compliant internee. They likely never imagined that this humble construction project was actually a profound act of self-determination. After 6 long months of back-breaking labor, it was finished. There, in the middle of the Arizona desert, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, sat a pristine, beautiful baseball diamond. It was a stunning achievement, a green jewel in a sea of brown. It was more than just a field. It was a monument to their own spirit. Kenichi Zenimura stood and looked at what they had built. It wasn't just a place to play a game, it was a statement. They had taken a piece of their prison and made it their own. They had created order out of chaos, hope out of despair. The great work was done, and now it was time to play ball. The completion of Zenimura Field transformed baseball at Gila River from a simple pastime into a full-fledged cultural phenomenon. It wasn't enough to have a field. They needed a league worthy of it. With Zenimura's expert guidance, they organized a massive, highly competitive league with an astounding 32 teams representing the various blocks and sections of the camp. This was no sandlot operation. The league had official rules, umpires, and a meticulously planned season schedule. Teams had names that evoked a sense of pride and identity, like the Gila River Aztecs or the Butte Eagles. They were no longer just Block 28. They were a team, a unit with a shared goal of winning the championship. The community's creativity shone through in the team uniforms. With no access to proper athletic wear, women in the camp took on the role of designers and seamstresses. They used scrap fabric, old potato sacks, and dye made from camp vegetables to create surprisingly professional-looking uniforms, complete with hand-stitched logos and numbers. Looking the part was half the battle. Game days became the highlight of the week, a vibrant festival of community life. Thousands of spectators would pack the wooden bleachers they had built themselves. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the buzz of a real ballpark. People brought picnics, placed friendly wagers, and cheered passionately for their home teams. It was a slice of normalcy in the most abnormal of places. For those few hours, the reality of the barbed wire fence just beyond the outfield seemed to melt away. Inside the park, they were not inmates of the US government. They were athletes and fans. They were fathers cheering for their sons, friends rooting against each other, and a community celebrating its own heroes. The field was their sanctuary. The quality of play was remarkably high. Many of the players had competed at top levels in the pre-war Nisei leagues, and their skills hadn't rusted away. The rivalries were intense, the games were hard-fought, and the players became local celebrities. Young boys would look up to stars like Taro Tanaka, the slick-fielding shortstop for the Aztecs, dreaming of one day playing on that same hallowed ground. The league provided a new social structure. It gave people a reason to interact, to form new friendships, and to rebuild the social fabric that had been shredded by the forced relocation. The games were a common ground where everyone, regardless of their former status or current hardship, could come together and share a single, unifying passion. Kenichi Zenemura was the league's commissioner, manager, and spiritual leader. He coached, he umpired, he maintained the field, and he ensured that the league was run with the utmost professionalism. His dedication elevated the entire enterprise, making it clear that this was not just a game. It was a serious expression of their community's character and pride. The Barbed Wire League was more than just a sports organization. It was a self-governing institution created by the internees, for the internees. It was proof that they could create a complex, thriving and joyous society on their own terms, without the oversight or permission of their captors. It was their Declaration of Independence, written in the language of baseball. As the first season progressed, the championship became the talk of the entire camp. The teams battled for a spot in the Gila River World Series. The stakes felt incredibly high, not just for the players, but for everyone. This championship was not about a trophy. It was about crowning their collective achievement and celebrating their enduring spirit. By early 1943, the war had changed. The United States was facing a severe manpower shortage and, in a moment of supreme irony, the government looked to the very population it had imprisoned to fill the ranks of its military. To facilitate this, and to begin the process of determining who could eventually leave the camps, the War Department and WRA issued a document. It was officially titled Application for Leave Clearance, but it would become infamous as the Loyalty Questionnaire. This single document would prove to be more divisive and destructive to the community than almost any other aspect of their incarceration. It was a bureaucratic loyalty test designed with a stunning lack of cultural understanding, and it would tear families apart. The questionnaire contained a series of questions, but it all came down to two key inquiries at the very end. Question 27 and Question 28. These two questions, each a minefield of implication and insult, would force every internee over the age of 17 into an impossible corner, with no right answer in sight. Question 27 asked, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?" For the young men, this was a slap in the face. They were being asked to volunteer to fight and potentially die for the very country that was currently holding them and their families captive behind barbed wire. Question 28 was even more insidious. It asked, Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? This question was a trap. For the Nisei, the American-born citizens, answering yes meant admitting to a loyalty to the Japanese emperor that they had never possessed in the first place. It was a tacit acknowledgement of guilt. For the Issei, their immigrant parents who were legally barred from becoming US citizens, forswearing allegiance to Japan would render them stateless, citizens of nowhere. The questionnaire ignited a firestorm of confusion, anger, and debate within the camps. How could they swear unqualified allegiance to a nation that had stripped them of their rights? Why should they renounce a loyalty they never had? The questions were not designed to gauge loyalty. They were designed to demand submission. Families argued intensely over how to answer. A yes response was seen by some as the only pragmatic way to prove their American patriotism and hopefully gain freedom. Others saw it as a complete capitulation, a betrayal of their own principles and dignity. They argued that their rights should be restored before they were asked to take on the responsibilities of citizenship. The pressure to answer was immense. The WRA made it clear that one's future, the possibility of leaving the camp, the type of work one could get, even the camp one would be sent to, depended on these answers. It was a loyalty test administered under duress, a cruel psychological game played with people's lives and identities. This poorly worded, culturally blind document succeeded where the barbed wire had failed. It shattered the unity of the incarcerated community. It created deep, painful rifts between friends, neighbors, and even within families, creating a new and bitter chapter in their already tragic story. The government's twist had turned them against each other. The loyalty questionnaire split the Gila River community into two fiercely opposed factions. Those who answered no to both question 27 and 28 became known as the No-No Boys. They were not disloyal to America, they were protesting the injustice of their situation. Their no was a principled stand against a government that demanded loyalty without offering rights in return. Their position was logical: restore our rights as citizens first, release our families, and then we will gladly discuss our obligations to the country. However, in the paranoid atmosphere of the time, this nuance was completely lost. The camp administration and the wider American public branded them as troublemakers, traitors, and enemy sympathizers. It was a gross mischaracterization of their courageous dissent. As a result of their answers, the No-No Boys were segregated from the general population and eventually shipped to a high-security camp at Tule Lake, California. This camp was effectively converted into a prison for the dissenters, a place with even more guards, higher fences, and a much harsher regime. They were punished for daring to question their own government. On the other side of the fracture were those who chose a different path to prove their loyalty. Thousands of young Nisei men answered yes, and volunteered for military service. They believed that the only way to win the fight for equality at home was to prove their patriotism unequivocally on the battlefields abroad. It was a heart-wrenching decision. These volunteers formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a segregated unit composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans. Their motto was, "Go for broke," and they fought with a ferocity born from a desperate need to prove their worth to a skeptical nation. They would leave their families behind in the camps to go fight for the very freedom they themselves had been denied. The 402nd became the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history. They fought with legendary bravery in the brutal campaigns of Italy and France, earning an incredible number of medals and suffering casualty rates that were astronomically high. They paid in blood for the right to be called Americans, a price no other citizen was asked to pay. This division created immense pain within the community. Families were literally torn apart, with one son being sent to Tool Lake as a disloyal and another shipping off to Europe as a volunteer soldier. There was no easy answer, and both sides felt they were doing the right thing, creating a tragic conflict of principles that left deep, lasting scars. The Baseball League was not immune to this fracture. Teammates who had been close friends now found themselves on opposite sides of this bitter divide. Arguments broke out in the barracks and on the sidelines. The sense of pure, unified community that had been forged around the ballpark began to crack under the immense political and emotional pressure. The questionnaire forced everyone to make an impossible choice. Do you protest injustice from within and risk being branded a traitor? Or do you submit to the injustice in the hopes that your sacrifice will eventually lead to acceptance? The No-No Boys and the volunteers of the 442nd represented the two horns of this terrible dilemma, a fracture that defined the later years of the internment. For those who remained at Gila River, deemed loyal by the government's crude metric, a new and unexpected possibility began to emerge. The government, eager to reduce the camp populations and showcase the success of their program, started to dangle a tantalizing prize, the chance for an early release. The doors of the prison were about to creak open. Beginning in mid-1943, the War Relocation Authority initiated a program of leave clearance. For the Nisei who had answered yes, yes on the loyalty questionnaire and could pass an FBI background check, a path out of the camps was now possible. It wasn't a blanket release or an apology. It was a carefully controlled parole system with a long list of conditions. To be eligible for leave, an internee needed a sponsor on the outside. This meant finding a job and a place to live, all while being locked in a desert prison with limited communication. Churches, resettlement committees, and a few brave individuals tried to help, but opportunities were scarce. Most of America was not exactly eager to welcome Japanese Americans into their towns. Furthermore, the freedom was geographically restricted. The entire West Coast, where nearly all the internees had once lived, was still a designated military zone and strictly off-limits. They were being offered the chance to leave, but on the condition that they not return home. They had to start completely new lives in unfamiliar places like Chicago, Denver, or Cleveland. This offer presented a daunting prospect. Leaving the camp meant abandoning the fragile but powerful community they had built. It meant trading the certainty of camp life, however miserable, for the complete uncertainty of a hostile world. They would be alone, with little money, facing widespread discrimination in their search for housing and employment. For many older Issei, the idea was terrifying. They had lost everything once already and lacked the language skills or energy to start all over again in a strange city. For them, the security of the camp, where they were surrounded by familiar faces and culture, was preferable to the frightening unknown of the outside world. But for the young, ambitious Nisei, the offer was a beacon of hope. It was a chance to escape the soul-crushing boredom and lack of opportunity in the camp. It was a chance to reclaim their lives, to go to college, to start a career, and to feel like an individual again, not just a number in a government file. Slowly, a trickle of internees began to leave Gila River. Each departure was a bittersweet event. There was joy for the person regaining their freedom, but also sadness for the community losing a member. The fabric of camp society was beginning to fray as people left one by one, heading off to uncertain futures. The baseball league was hit particularly hard. The teams were made up of exactly the demographic most likely to seek leave clearance: young, able-bodied Nisei men. As the 1944 baseball season got underway, the best players in the league began receiving their papers. Their ticket to freedom had finally arrived, right in the middle of a heated pennant race. This created a whole new dilemma. The offer of freedom was personal, an individual's chance to escape. But the baseball league was communal, built on teamwork, loyalty, and a shared commitment. The needs of the individual were now in direct conflict with the needs of the team, setting the stage for a shocking and profound decision. The door to the cage was open. All they had to do was walk through it. But for a dedicated group of young men, their hearts and minds were focused on something else entirely. They were focused on the championship, the question of what truly mattered more. Individual liberty or collective loyalty was about to be answered on a dusty baseball diamond. As the 1944 Gila River baseball season reached its dramatic peak, the leave clearances began to arrive in earnest. One by one, star players from the top teams received their official documents from the WRA. These were the golden tickets, the papers that granted them permission to walk out of the gate and back into the world. It was the moment they had all been waiting for. Taro Tanaka, the star shortstop for the powerhouse Gila River Aztecs, was one of the first. His team was undefeated and heading into the playoffs. He had a job offer waiting for him at a factory in Chicago. His dream of freedom was now a reality. He held the paper in his hand, a pass to a new life, away from the dust and the despair. He shared the news with his teammates. There was initial excitement and congratulations, but it was quickly followed by a somber realization. If Taro left, the team's chances of winning the championship would be shattered. The same scenario was playing out across the league, with key players on other contending teams also receiving their leave papers. The league itself was in jeopardy. A meeting was called. The players who had received their clearances gathered to discuss their future. The debate was intense. On one hand was the undeniable pull of freedom, the chance to leave the prison camp behind forever. On the other was the deep bond of loyalty they felt to their teammates and the community that had invested so much in the league. Then one of the players said something that would become legendary in camp lore. When asked when he was planning to leave, he simply shrugged and said, "I can't go now. We have a game on Sunday." It was a simple statement, but it perfectly captured a sentiment that was shockingly common. A handful of others quickly agreed. Taro Tanaka made his decision. He walked into the administration office and informed the stunned WRA official that he was respectfully declining his leave clearance for the time being. He would not be leaving. He had a championship to win. He chose his team over his own freedom. He was not the only one. Several of the league's best players made the exact same choice. To an outsider, this decision seems baffling, even insane. Why would anyone choose to remain in a concentration camp when offered the chance to leave? But to understand their choice is to understand the profound meaning the baseball league had taken on. It wasn't just a game, it was the one thing in their lives they had complete control over. The outside world offered a conditional, uncertain freedom in a society that still viewed them with hatred and suspicion. But inside the camp, on their field, they had something more tangible. They had respect, purpose, community, and dignity. They were not Japs. They were star athletes, local heroes, and loyal teammates. Their refusal was a quiet but powerful act of defiance. The government could imprison their bodies, but it could not dictate their priorities or break their commitments to each other. Their loyalty was not to the bureaucratic WRA, but to the community they had built and the promises they had made to the men standing next to them on the field. This shocking choice demonstrated that they had redefined freedom on their own terms. It wasn't just about the absence of barbed wire. It was about having a purpose that mattered, a community that cared, and the autonomy to honor their own commitments. For these young men, finishing the season was a more meaningful act of freedom than walking out the gate. With the league's best players having chosen to stay, the championship playoffs began with an unprecedented level of excitement and emotional weight. Every game was now imbued with the knowledge of the sacrifice these young men had made. They had literally put their freedom on hold for this, and the entire community felt the significance of their decision. The final series, the Gila River World Series, pitted the two best teams against each other. It was more than just a sporting event. It was the culmination of everything they had built and endured. It was the climax of their shared story of resilience, a celebration of their ability to create joy and meaning in the face of profound injustice. On the day of the final game, the atmosphere at Zinamura Field was electric. It felt like the whole world was there. Over 6,000 spectators, more than half the camp's population, packed the grandstand and lined the foul lines. They were loud, passionate, and deeply invested. This wasn't just entertainment, it was their story reaching its final chapter. The game itself was a hard-fought, dramatic affair. Players like Taro Tanaka, who could have been hundreds of miles away starting a new life, played with an intensity that reflected the weight of their choice. Every pitch, every swing of the bat, every diving catch was a justification for their decision to stay. They left everything they had on that field. For the players, this was their ultimate act of control. The government had dictated where they lived, what they ate, and when they slept. But here, on this diamond, they had carved out of the desert with their own hands. Their fate was their own. Winning or losing was up to them, their skill, their teamwork, their heart. That was a powerful, intoxicating feeling. The game became a symbol of their entire incarceration experience. It represented their ability to find order in chaos, to build community in isolation, and to achieve excellence despite oppression. It was a testament to the fact that while their bodies were confined, their spirits remained fiercely, stubbornly free to pursue their own passions. When the final out was recorded and the champions celebrated on the field, the roar from the crowd was deafening. It was a release of every pent-up emotion from the past 2 years, the frustration, the anger, the sorrow, but also the pride and the joy. They weren't cheering for just a baseball team. They were cheering for themselves, for their own survival and spirit. The victory celebration was not about a trophy or bragging rights. It was a moment of profound communal triumph. They had faced the worst their country could throw at them, and in response, they had not only survived, they had built something beautiful and meaningful. They had hosted their own World Series in the middle of a prison. This championship was the ultimate proof of their resilience. It was their final, glorious act of self-determination within the confines of the barbed wire. They had proven to themselves and to history that the human need for dignity, purpose, and community can be a force more powerful than any prison gate or government decree. The season was over. The championship had been won. The players who had delayed their freedom had honored their commitment. Now, and only now, were they ready to face the world outside. They had finished what they started on their own terms, and that made all the difference. In January 1945, the Supreme Court ruling in Ex parte Endo declared that the government could no longer detain loyal American citizens. The exclusion order for the West Coast was lifted, and the WRA announced that all camps would be closed within the year. The war in the Pacific would end months later. The long-awaited moment had finally arrived. The gates were opening for everyone. But the news was met not with universal joy, but with a complex mix of relief, anxiety, and profound dread. The freedom that awaited them was a terrifyingly uncertain prospect. They were being evicted from the only homes they had known for the past 3 years and sent back out into a world that had not magically become more welcoming. The government's parting gift was a one-way train ticket and a paltry $25 per person. With this, they were expected to rebuild their lives from scratch. Their homes had been sold, their businesses liquidated, their farms seized. They had nothing to return to. The economic devastation was almost total, a loss from which many families would never fully recover. Worse than the financial ruin was the lingering prejudice. Anti-Japanese sentiment was still rampant, especially on the West Coast. No Japs allowed signs were common. There were documented cases of violence, terrorism, and arson against the returning families. The same hatred that had sent them to the camps was waiting to greet them upon their return. This bitter reality cast the Gila River community in a new light. In retrospect, the camp, for all its hardship, had also been a sanctuary. Behind the barbed wire, they were safe from the racism of the outside world. They were a majority. They ran their own society, spoke their own language, and supported each other. That cohesive world was now being dismantled. The decision of the baseball players to delay their release suddenly seemed less shocking and far more prescient. They had chosen to remain in a place where they had dignity, purpose, and the respect of their peers, rather than rush out into a world that offered them none of those things. Their prison had in many ways been more of a home than the America that awaited them. As the internees packed their bags and boarded the trains to leave Gila River for the last time, they were leaving more than just the barracks and the dust. They were leaving behind the gardens they had tended, the schools they had founded, the friendships they had forged in shared adversity, and the magnificent baseball field that had been the heart of their world. The barbed wire league was no more. Its players and fans were scattering to the four winds, off to face their individual struggles in a country that had yet to atone for its sins. The bonds of that unique community, forged in the crucible of the desert, would never be replicated. The freedom they had gained came at the cost of the world they had built. The open gate was not a triumphant portal to liberation, but a threshold to a new and difficult chapter. The struggle for survival was not over, it was simply changing location. For the internees of Gila River, freedom was not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of a long, arduous road to reclaiming their place in America. The dust of the Arizona desert would eventually reclaim Zenemura Field, burying the base paths and the pitcher's mound. But the legacy of what happened there would endure, a powerful story of how a group of prisoners found a unique form of freedom, not by escaping their prison, but by transforming it. In the end, the story of the Gila River Baseball League isn't about prisoners who didn't want to be free. It is a far more complex and profound story about people who were forced to redefine what freedom truly meant when everything they knew had been taken from them by their own country. They discovered that true liberty isn't merely the absence of physical barriers, it's found in purpose, in community, and above all, in the dignity that comes from controlling your own destiny. Within that camp, they weren't racial stereotypes or government file numbers. They were the stars of the Aztecs, heroes to their neighbors, and builders of a dream. The choice to stay for a baseball championship was not an escape from reality, but an affirmation of a deeper reality they had created for themselves. The field they built with sweat and defiance was, for one brief and glorious season, perhaps the freest place in all of America. A powerful lesson that endures long after the dust has settled. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into a forgotten corner of history. The story of Gila River forces us to ask deep questions. What does freedom truly mean to you? Is it a place, or is it a state of mind built on dignity and community? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button to help us share more important histories like this one. We'll see you in the next video.